All right, the election of 1852 we've just talked about, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, or Ike as he was known, is going to win the election pretty handily. You can see the Electoral College map picture I've placed in the upper right hand corner. The blue is for the Democratic candidate Stevenson, and the red is for Ike. So as you can see, everybody in America liked Ike. All right. So, in effect, Ike's presidency is going to be known as dynamic conservatism. And conservatism is a word we're going to talk about a lot here in the rest of Unit 8 and into Unit 9 as well. Ike is going to maintain New Deal programs. Social Security benefits are going to be extended. Minimum wage is going to be raised to $1 an hour. He is going to try to balance government policy with New Deal, World War II, and Truman's Fair Deal. One of the big things Eisenhower is going to be known for is the interstate highway system. Created in 1954, it's our modern interstate freeway system. A picture of it is in the right-hand corner in the bottom. It's a $27 billion plan to build 42,000 miles of railroad. Our freeways, not railroads. We are way past railroads. Countless jobs on construction is going to help speed up the suburbanization of America. The government is going to pay 90% of the freeway system costs, where the states are going to chip in 10%. The underlying purpose of the highway system, and this is kind of key because Eisenhower is a military man. So why he wants this is not for the Sunday driving, not for the increase in the automobile industry. He wants it for the evacuation in case we end up in a nuclear war or we need to move troops and equipment quickly through the country. Our road system at the time would not allow for this type of maneuvering, and Ike knew we needed a way to do that in case of nuclear war. It's also very popular now for evacuations due to storms, hurricanes, things like that. The railroad industry is going to suffer significantly because of this. Automobiles are going to grow significantly, as well as airlines. He is also going to create the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to kind of continue to oversee some of FDR's New Deal. But we're going to see a huge Ike try to balance our federal budget, which he's not going to be able to do too successfully. He wanted to guard against what he called creeping socialism. He did reduce defense spending from our gross national product from 13% to 10%. He tries to reduce price supports for farmers, but that isn't very successful. And in 1959, Eisenhower is going to accrue our highest peacetime deficit in all of U.S. history. Like Reagan, he is going to support tax rates for corporations and individuals with high incomes. So this is where we start to see that that particular platform in the Republican Party. That is still something that we continue to see today as a member of the Republican Party. He's going to favor privatizing large government holdings, such as offshore oil, from the federal government to the states, and encourage private power companies to compete with the TVA. And labor unions, part of the reason labor unions are going to grow in power is we do have some unemployment jitters due to some businesses going under in the 1950s. 1955, the AFL and the CIO, the two powerful labor unions we've discussed in the last couple units, are going to merge. They are going to replace the Teamster Union, another big union in the late 1950s, because Teamsters are going to kind of be known as the labor union, not of gangsters, but they practice the gangsterism. And the head of that is going to be Jimmy Hoffa. And Jimmy Hoffa is very famous because in the early 1970s, he disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to him. Nobody knows where he was buried. We're assuming he was dead. And so the thing throughout the last 1980s, 90s, 2000 is what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. And a lot of times they'll be digging graves or something. They'll dig up a backyard because they think Hoffa's buried there. And of course he's not. So Jimmy Hoffa during the 1950s and 60s is going to be head of the Teamster Union. He is going to be considered the most powerful union boss in all of U.S. history. He replaces our greatly mustached man, Samuel Gompers. He's going to influence politicians with what we call hardball tactics, kind of arm twisting. He will threaten to get his way. And we're going to see the Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959, kind of in addition to the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. And this is going to be Eisenhower's response basically to Jimmy Hoffa, threatening defeat for U.S. congressmen who support strong labor bills. To kind of crack down on labor unions. The bill is designed to basically make it illegal, some of the financial activities that unions had been doing, and what we call strong arm tactics. But in 1954, there are some economic woes going on, and the Republicans are going to lose control of both houses in Congress. In 1958, Alaska is going to be admitted as our 49th state, and the following year, Hawaii is going to become our 50th state under Eisenhower. Now, let's talk about civil rights in the 1950s. The NAACP is going to achieve some desegregation, but Eisenhower does not intend to be a civil rights president. Yet, some of the most significant gains in civil rights are going to occur on his watch. In the 1940s, the NAACP is going to start attacking the separate but equal rule we see with Plessy versus Ferguson. In colleges, universities, blacks are going to start to gain entrance into some southern universities. Elementary and secondary schools, however, are going to still remain segregated. And that's where we get the Warren Court. Earl Warren is going to be appointed by Eisenhower as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1953. Warren is viewed by Eisenhower and many as a conservative during this time period. However, he is going to become what we call the most liberal judge of the 20th century. So his court is very important. This goes back to synthesis. We have the Marshall Court and the three very famous Marshall Court cases. Then we have the Taney Court and the horrible Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, which would play into synthesis for the civil rights movement. We have, of course, Plessy versus Ferguson, another separate but equal is okay, and this is what the NAACP is starting to challenge in the 1940s. It's going to come to play in one of the biggest Supreme Court cases in U.S. history, and this is Brown versus Board of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. You can see on the far left, or far right, is a picture of the High Court banning segregation and the fateful day. That's a very famous photo. Okay, so the NAACP, this is going back to the Brown case. NAACP is going to file a lawsuit on behalf of Linda Brown, a black elementary school student. The Topeka School Board had been denying Brown admission to an all-white school, and the case is going to make its way through our court system all the way up to the Supreme Court. Another famous lawyer named Thurgood Marshall, who will eventually become a Supreme Court justice in his own right, charged that public school segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to our Constitution, that segregation deprived blacks of an equal educational opportunity, and that separate could not be equal because segregation in itself lowered the moral and motivation of black students. Marshall is going to argue that the court should overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate educational facilities are inherently equal and have no place in public education. That is going to be the ruling factor or the ruling statement from Chief Justice Warren. And 1 year later, the courts are going to order school integration with all deliberate speed. Now we have some responses to Brown versus Board of Education. The South is not going to like this decision at all. And Eisenhower is going to urge caution, feeling that the federal government should not try and force segregation, and calls the appointment of Warren his biggest mistake. 80% of Southern whites are going to oppose the Brown decision. Some white students, encouraged by parents, refuse to attend integrated schools. The KKK is going to reemerge in much more violent way than we saw in the 1920s. Southern state legislators are going to pass more than 450 laws aimed at preventing the enforcement of Brown versus Board of Education. Massive resistance in Virginia. And by 1962, only 0.5% of non-white school children in the South were in integrated schools. So the South is going to move extremely slow on this matter. And then we're going to move into our crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957. This is the Little Rock Nine. So the famous photo from Little Rock Nine you can see is the left one. That is an all African-American student being escorted into school with the white students yelling at her. So what's going to happen? Governor Orville Faubus is going to order the National Guard to surround Central High School to prevent the 9 black students, further known as the Little Rock Nine, from entering the school and desegregating it. The federal court ordered the removal of the National Guard to allow the students to enter, and riots are going to erupt. What Eisenhower is going to do is what's interesting. He is actually going to federalize the Arkansas National Guard, basically placing them under control of the federal government. And he is going to force them to open up the schools for these 9 black students. And this is the first time since Reconstruction that a president has sent federal troops into the South to enforce the Constitution. And on top of federalizing the Arkansas National Guard, he's going to send in 1,000 troops as well. So eventually the school ends up becoming segregated. Or desegregated, I'm sorry. But the African American students have a very tough time transitioning. A few of them are actually kicked out of schools, not really because of their fault, but they were bullied, things like that. Their food was spit in, food was thrown on them, and then when they attempted to fight back, of course, the school board is going to expel them from Little Rock Central High. But a few of them do end up managing to graduate. However, the next year, the Little Rock School District actually does an interesting thing. Instead of allowing the schools to be open, they're going to close the schools during the school year of 1958 to 1959. And this is going to be known as the lost year, because they couldn't deal with the idea of segregation or desegregation, I should say. So most African Americans in Little Rock did not attend school at all that year. White students would attend private schools or go to schools outside of the school district, but a lot of teachers within Little Rock School District did open up their homes to students and allow them to come in and study every day, private tutoring, things like that, in order to try to maintain some sense of normalcy in the South. And then moving on, another very famous motion in the civil rights is going to be the Montgomery bus boycott from 1955 to 1956. And this is going to be the famous story of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was an African-American lady who refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man, and she was ordered to sit in the back of the bus with the rest of the African Americans. She, of course, refused to give up her seat. She was found guilty and fined $14. 150 other members have been arrested and charged as well. And so Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who is starting to make his way as a famous civil rights leader, is going to convince people in Montgomery, Alabama to boycott riding the bus. 80% of the people who rode the bus were African Americans getting to their jobs within the city. And because of the boycott, the city was losing money like crazy. They had to end up desegregating the buses because the boycott lasted for over 400 days. Martin Luther King's home was actually firebombed. 88 other black leaders were arrested and fined for conspiracy for the boycott. So the city really did everything to try to prevent the lasting impact of this boycott, but it made a huge financial mark on the city of Montgomery, Alabama. And Martin Luther King is going to end up becoming president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he is going to follow the rule of Gandhi, and that is nonviolent resistance. So he is going to ensure that his people do not provoke